Hello. This is a follow-up video from my previous one, and this is basically going to show us how we use stored procedures, timers, to run variables and stored procedures, but also to loop through where you would normally have a where statement in SQL. You can't really do that on PowerApps, so this is using timers to check to see if the variables fall within their remit, and then run again and again and again until the point at which you want it to stop. So in effect, exactly like a where statement in SQL. So this is what it's doing, and then we click on that button and it's converted all of our 6 training tables, a table for staff, a table for staff training required, and it's converting all of that and putting it into useful information in a collection within PowerApps. And it's surprisingly quick considering that it is using a lot of data. The reason we have 6 training tables is because there is so much data that basically every time it hits the 5,000 limit we need to create a new list. So I'm going to show you how it does it. So this button here is quite simple. Just sets the variables up and then navigates to the screen. So this screen on start will start running these timers. So this is the first timer, and this is basically going to check to see if this variable is within the maximum, and if it isn't, oh no, that's the timer end, apologies. On timer start, it's going to check to see whether the counter is within the minimum and the maximum. And then it's going to set the current role based on the counter. And we're using ID because that's a really good thing to avoid delegation. So it does mean that you can go up to, in theory, 25,000 rows, but because our lists are hosted on SharePoint, we have a maximum of 5,000. So that does break through the 2,000 limit that PowerApps normally implements on collections. So this is just basically clearing the holding table for the role, then it's transposing those 30 courses, and so the list for this is basically loads of job roles in each row and then up to 30 courses within the columns, and we're just transposing that. So instead of being that way around, which isn't very useful, you would have to type in 30 lines of code for every time you wanted to find something within that. What this is doing instead is creating one column for the job role and then 30 rows, which means that you can just go, is it that job role? Then give me all 30 rows. It's much more simple. Obviously not very practical in a SharePoint list, really. Works better in the list as it is. But for this purpose, we want it to transpose the data like this. And then it just goes through and sets the counter and everything we need for that. And then on timer end, can't type today. It's basically just taking that counter, setting the counter to +1 so that it moves on to the next row. And it's also setting a variable for some display settings, something further that you don't really need. And it sets a few other variables which will then start other timers. So the display settings I'm talking about is it will change the text within these and the display within those as well. So it will then move on to the second timer. And the second timer is basically taking the variable and checking to see if it's less than the maximum of that variable. And that variable for this one is the staff name. So it's filtering all of those 6 training tables, finding the training for that individual member of staff, and then creating it in a collection. And on the timer end, it's quite simple. It's just increasing that by 1 every time, and then goes on to the next ID, which is the next staff member. And this then sets the training timer start, and that is this one. And so when that second timer ends, it will start the third timer, which creates a grouped collection, which is basically putting all of those three areas that it's taken in previous team training on the previous timer, and it's putting those into one column. And that's just doing that so that it's a lot easier to work with. Again, there are a lot of workarounds in this. Some of it may seem nonsensical, but it is there for a reason, and it does make the app run a lot smoother. So this is then clearing and collecting the gallery copy, and the gallery copy is a copy of a gallery. And the reason we're using galleries is because it allows us to implement labels that have lookups and if statements. And it's just a much easier way to work with the data by putting it into a gallery first. We then find all of the data from different tables or with if statements. That gives us the information that we need. So it's then copying that gallery, and then we are going into a distinct collection. So having this allows us to basically say if the title, course title, and the latest date of the course, and whether it's a core requirement, is distinct. And that basically removes a tons of duplicates that people are recording, which is an issue that needs to be addressed later on in the app. But this is just going to remove all of those duplicates, and that's why we concatenate all of that information together, is so that we can check to see if it's a duplicate. So that's what happens on the timer start for that. And if we go to the timer end, it's quite simple. It's just saying stop this timer and then select a stored procedure. Now you can't actually create stored procedures from PowerApps. You can create what is in effect a stored procedure by building into a button. And these timers are acting like stored procedures as well. So the on select for this is then creating a new collection based on that distinct collection that we just built within a previous timer, and it's splitting those concatenations out, and it's as simple as that. And then that is fed into this gallery here. Once again, we're using the gallery because it's a lot easier to build the data how you want it to work and how you want it to look. Obviously, within the actual app, none of this is visible. So this creates that gallery. And what happens when you are clicking on the button that appears just below, if I can find the correct button, is that it's just taking that gallery there and putting it into a collection. So it's very similar to the previous timer. We're just using the gallery for for collection purposes, so we can run if statements and lookups and filters and things like that for the information that we want. It's a lot easier to work with instead of building a collection and having those run through each time. That'd be quite a time-consuming process for it. Much easier to do it like this. So that's all that's doing, and then it's transitioning on to this screen here. And this screen, this collection, it's quite simple, is now using the new data. So this is filtering one of the core lists going straight to SharePoint, and then it's just going to take the tables that we've created and run calculations based on it. It's kind of what you would do in Power BI with your inner joins and when you're running queries that run as soon as the data is loaded. That's how it's working in this. So it's almost like trying to turn PowerApps into Power BI. It's nowhere near as fast, nowhere near as good. But if the people that are using the app want that sort of information displayed on an app, running variables through timers and stored procedures is probably the best way to do it. It runs quite quick. You can change the timer durations depending on how long it takes to get that data. So some of these durations the simple one, for example, is running at, sorry, the first one, which is very simple, is running at half a second. So every half second it's going through. The only reason I've set it as half a second is to give it enough leeway to slow down if it needs to. This one is then running at 3 seconds because it's a bit more complicated. And same for this one, I believe this is running at 2 seconds. And that's just to make sure that you're giving it enough time to go away, run that code that you've specified within that timer, and come back, and then loop again and do the same thing again and again and again until your variables have maxed out. Anyway, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know.